Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to What's Happening. My name is Chloe Cooley, and here with me I have Dr. Lori Owens. We're going to have a great episode today. Dr. Owens, we have talked about you. Every guest I've brought on has talked about you or has known you. I just am so excited that you're finally here with us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here this morning. Thank you for asking me.
Of course. So, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, where you're from?
Sure. I'm from Cherokee County, so I commute from Cherokee County every day. Been doing that since 1998. So the reason probably some of your guests mentioned me is I've been here a long time. So I've seen a lot of different changes at the university over the years. So, but Cherokee County is where I call home.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm from Marshall County, so still not too far from here. So that's great that you've stayed around for so long. So we were talking earlier before we started. So you said that teaching was not always your plan.
No, it wasn't. As an undergrad, I majored in political science, and that stemmed from I had a civics class when I was in the 9th grade and became very interested in the study of politics and government, and then I worked on a few campaigns, and so I started with a political science major thinking I would go to law school. And I got to my junior year, and I thought, I don't think I really want to be a lawyer. So what am I going to do with a political science degree? And one of my history professors actually suggested that I think about pursuing a PhD and teaching at the college level, and so that ended up being what I did. And of course, the irony is I'm now the pre-law advisor. So I always tell people, have a backup plan for your political science major. It's a great major, but you do have to have a plan for it. It's not like a nursing degree or an education degree that you can more easily move into the workforce.
Yeah, there's a lot of options with political science that you can do. So,
especially if you're young and you're willing to move to Montgomery or Washington, D.C. There's a lot of different things you can do with political science.
Yeah, basically anything, I would say. So I kind of want to talk about this briefly. So you've traveled a lot to the Middle East. Where all have you been?
Well, my travels actually started in 2002 when I was awarded a NATO European Union study tour. And I'd never had a passport till I was 31. I'm first generation college, so we didn't take trips to Europe when I was growing up. My dad took us to the World's Fair in 1982 in Knoxville because he felt like that'd be the closest it would ever be to us. So like a lot of students who attend JSU now, I had not traveled abroad. And so after my NATO European Union study tour was done in Brussels, Belgium, I stayed over on my own dime and bought a rail pass for 4 or 5 countries for about 3 weeks. And I traveled throughout the region, Germany, France, Austria, and made some friends in Germany and Wiesbaden, and they invited me to come and stay with them a few days. So that's when I started my more extensive travel. And then because of my teaching Middle East and me serving as the faculty advisor for the Model Arab League team, that opened up opportunities for me to engage in fellowships that they offered. And so my first fellowship was actually to Yemen in 2008. Now, when I went in 2008, almost nobody had heard of Yemen. Of course, now they have, but not for good reasons. And the trip to Yemen, the fellowship to Yemen, ended up being a really life-changing experience for me. It was almost like biblical times. It was still so very traditional. People, donkeys everywhere, people, 3 or 4 people riding on a motorcycle, people, farming in the area. The capital of Yemen is a UN World Heritage Site. So I could bring all of those things back to my classes and make it real for them. And the topics I get the most questions about are when I share these experiences. And the reason I share them is I want our students to start thinking about they can apply for these things too. Because if students do Model Arab League, it makes them eligible to apply for study visits that they have for students. Now, we ended up being the last education group to go to Yemen because after that, the wheels really started falling off. In fact, the embassy had a scaled-down staff by the time, we were there. And then my next fellowship to the region was to Oman, and it was over December 2015 to January 2016. And a very different experience than Yemen. Right next door, but Oman is a oil-producing country. They have oil money. They don't have the money that the Saudis do. But they have wanted to hold on to their traditions too. They have rules about their architecture. You can't build a building that's over so many stories high because they don't want that competing with the traditional architecture that's in Oman. So all those things you can bring alive to your students. And what I always tell students is go ahead now and get a passport and have it ready because they're good for 10 years. Because I once had a student who had an opportunity to go on a fellowship to Saudi Arabia but didn't have a passport. So you never know. And you never know, when I applied for these things, I think, well, I don't have a chance getting something like this from Jacksonville State. They're going to select somebody from one of the big state schools. Well, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they select people from regional universities. So if you don't apply to things, you for sure won't get them. So my message to students is, go ahead and apply for that if that's something that you want.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. And I just wanted to bring this up because when I first met you, it was because I was taking your Governments of the Middle East class, and you always showed pictures of the places you've been, or you would bring things that you bought while you were there. And I think that really did give us a good idea of what these countries are like. And that's not something that you can always get because not every teacher has traveled to every place that they're teaching about. But I think that was a really good perspective that you gave your students.
Well, thank you, and I hope that was my intent with that, to broaden their horizons and make it real for them. That these places become more real to people once you can see actual photographs and items that are grown there or made there. Whenever I go anywhere, I try to buy art or other things that have been made in that country for my purposes and also to share with students.
Yeah, and especially now, I guess it's interesting to learn about those countries since most of the countries are unsafe to travel to. You can't go to Yemen well, maybe you could, but it would not be a good decision, I would say, in the state of the world right now.
No, not at the moment. I would one day like to go back to Yemen. My heart goes out to Yemen because we had soldiers that were guarding us when we were there. And we asked them, why did you choose this for a living? And they said, well, there really weren't many choices. And with all the chaos and destruction and war in Yemen, I've often wondered what has happened to those soldiers who were in jobs that they really didn't want to be in, but that was the only way they could provide for their families.
Yeah, that is very sad, but I guess that's the reality in some of those countries over there is you just do what you have to do. So one of the things I remember most from your class was that you made all of us pick a country, and we had to write position papers and make presentations about that country. And mine was Lebanon, and I knew nothing about Lebanon when I picked it, or I probably would have picked a different country. But
it's not the easiest country to do a profile of.
No, because there's nothing posted about it online. Nothing. So it was very difficult to do that. But I think that was a good thing that you made us do because it was like digging through trenches trying to find any bit of information for most of our countries. So I think that was really interesting that we did that. I definitely learned a lot about it, and my writing definitely improved from having to write about what was it, like something about the prison system in Lebanon or something like that. So I think that was definitely one of my most memorable things from your class. So this is probably a very obvious question, but you think that visiting these places has helped you become a better teacher? Not even in just Middle East classes, but in general, like in all of your classes?
It has, and I've been to other places besides that. One place that I went that was really memorable was Cuba in 2019, and I wanted to see it because Cuba's in a time warp, and so I did a people-to-people exchange. But it it opens your eyes to how others live. It makes you more appreciative of living here. The things, the liberties that we have here, the conveniences that we have here. I spent 10 days in Cuba. By day 10, I was ready to return to the United States. But I'm that way about most any place I go. There's no place like home. But it also makes you more empathetic with countries that are struggling. But one of the things that I've found is even where the countries where they're struggling, Yemen would be one of them, Cuba another. I've been amazed at the ingenuity of the locals just making things work, and the good attitude. Like in Yemen, children were playing in the streets with old shoes and old water hoses. They didn't have any of the toys that we would normally go to a local store and buy for children to use. But they were laughing and playing, and they loved for you to take their photo. And back then, digital cameras were just becoming a big thing, and they wanted to borrow your digital camera because they loved to take a photo themselves and then look and see the image there. So, but the ingenuity of making things work in the circumstances, because they really don't have a choice. So their attitude is a lot. So we could learn a lot from that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize how grateful they should be for living in America. Like, yes, America has its problems, and there's always going to be problems, but it's so much better off than most places, I would say.
Well, I've been to a lot of places, and with all of our problems, I'd still rather have our problems than the problems that some of these other countries have.
Yeah. For sure. So do you have anywhere else that you want to visit in the future or go back to, perhaps?
Well, I mentioned at some point I would like to go back to Yemen. That won't be anytime soon for obvious reasons. The friends I made in Wiesbaden, Germany, 22 years ago now, I would love to go back and visit with them. Croatia's on my list. I would like to visit Croatia. Jordan, in terms of the region. Jordan is a country that I would like to be able to go to sometime in the near future. So sometimes I travel for, it's more educational, has an educational component to it. I try to loop in some type of educational component even when I'm just personal vacations. Like next summer I'm going to take a river cruise. But we're going to loop in some things where at the stops, I want to be able to learn some things about those places. And some places you go to and you think, well, I want to come back here and spend some more time. And so, you just kind of have to decide what you want to spend your money on. Now, I have the luxury of not having a child, so I've got more disposable income, than some people do. And I don't want to wait till I retire to do my travels, because some people, when they retire, some may lose their health.
Yeah.
And I've got colleagues here that didn't make it to retirement. They were diagnosed with a catastrophic illness, and they didn't get to do that.
Yeah.
So
I'm kind of that way where it's like I don't want to wait until a different time to go travel, because, well, you also never know what's going to happen to you, but you never know what's going to happen in the world. The
Right.
places that you want to go to might not be there in the future. Like, I know that in Italy, Venice is sinking. If you don't go see it now, you're probably not going to see it in the future. So I'm just kind of, I've grown up traveling, and my family is big travelers. But I'm just the kind of person that's I'm so okay with just one day spontaneously being okay, I'll go hop on a plane. I would do it. I'm all for traveling. So we can talk about briefly everything that's going on in Israel right now, which is a heartbreaking situation. But since this is your field, I just wanted to get your perspective on it, because I figured you would have some unique opinions on what's going on.
Well, I started teaching the course on the Middle East in 1999, and really what led to that was more related to being the faculty advisor for Model Arab League. And you said you learned a lot about Lebanon from doing that research paper. You also learn a lot when you're teaching a subject. And so I dove in in 1999. I just studied it generally when I was in graduate school. I'd actually studied more on Latin America when I was in graduate school. But the situation that unfolded back in the fall, of course, with Israel and Hamas, is a threat not only to the region but to the rest of us. Nobody wants to get sucked into that particular situation. Now, nobody in the region wants to see Hamas be successful. You know, that's the trouble when you talk about the Middle East. People tend to paint it with a broad brush. Especially a lot of people around here, they think Middle East means you're a terrorist. No, that's not the case. Most people that live in the region are like us. They want to be able to provide for their families. They want their kids to have a good education. They want to have a decent standard of living. They want to be left alone. You've got your fundamentalist and you've got your terrorists. We have domestic terrorism here, okay? So you can't paint it that way. It's like, I also teach Southern politics, and I will jokingly say there's not a lot of difference in Southern politics and Middle East. But I'm really not joking. You've got dynamic people in those regions that are sometimes very loud. You've got unique things about the region, but when you unpack the region, you also have some things that are very distinct within the region, and all those things have to be analyzed. And so it's particularly concerning for the country of Jordan, who's been a long-time ally for the United States. And Jordan has absorbed and taken in a lot of refugees ever since the first war, Arab-Israeli war. And, in fact, a lot of people talked about maybe a Palestinian state being carved out of Jordan. I don't know that they've talked with Jordan about that. But a number of people that are now living in Jordan are not native to Jordan, and some of them are more sympathetic to Hamas. And so the longer this conflict goes on, the more dangerous it is for Jordan, the more dangerous it is for the region, and for the rest of us. And Jordan has parliamentary elections coming up in August, and so nobody knows how those parliamentary elections are going to shake out in light of what's happening now. And then, of course, you have the additional thing that happened over the weekend with Iran and the drone attacks. But a pretty strong message was sent to Iran as a result of this. So, we will see how that plays out. The irony is that, Arabs are united in their opposition to and wanting to be able to control Iran. But no reasonable Arab country wants to see Hamas be victorious either. So there's some things that the Arab countries and the state of Israel, can agree on, and along with the rest of us.
Yeah, it is. It almost felt unreal when I heard about it in the fall, and I know people that are in Israel right now because. So a few friends that I have, they got married and her husband got a job in Tel Aviv, and they've been in Israel since then. And just hearing like their perspectives on all of it, it's so scary. Like I think Americans like you said, they paint it in a broad brush, and we're so detached from it. We're like, oh, it's all the way over there. But hearing people that are from Alabama experiencing all of this conflict that's going on, it's insane.
What it brought back to me over the weekend was the Gulf War of 1990, and Iraq launched rockets into Israel. And we had asked Israel, if you're attacked, let us handle it. And that's immediately, what came to mind. Of course, the capability was there for them to knock down, the bulk of the drones. I mean, it really was a failed attack, by Iran. I don't know how that's going to. I don't know if they're going to be embarrassed about it and be emboldened even more. You're not dealing with reasonable actors, but I'm sure all the various scenarios that are being discussed at upper levels with all the relevant countries at this time. So,
yeah, and this is a little bit outside of your field, but I would also enjoy hearing your opinion on what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Like, where do you think that's going to head in the future?
Well, that's interesting. You've got a new Cold War. Of course, I'm of the age that I grew up, during the Cold War. And basically, Russia and Putin in particular, wants to see those glory days of the Russian Empire be, revisited. What you have to worry about is if he's successful in Ukraine, where does he go next? In fact, we had the chair of the Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers. He came to my class on the Middle East, and I let students ask them, any question they wanted to. It didn't have to be on the Middle East. Ukraine is not a NATO country, but some of her neighboring countries are. And NATO used to be a lot smaller club, but when the Cold War ended and we admitted more, a number of the former, Soviet republics. And of course, there's an article in NATO that if a NATO member is attacked, attack on one member is attack on all members. And that's a World War III scenario. So you don't want Putin to be victorious in Ukraine because you don't know where he might go next, because he does want to restore Russia to its glory days, of the empire, if you will. So, but it's a precarious situation for everybody, and it's kind of been. The whole world's on fire, basically, in a variety of different ways. So there's also things happening to the south of us related to China that a lot of people aren't aware of. We may or may not talk about that before we leave this morning. But, and of course, the votes in Congress are tied up. The packages for Israel, the packages for Ukraine. Just staying last night, I think there was some movement on some of that. But we'll just have to see. But that's why Ukraine matters. And people have differing opinions on that in terms of how much the U.S. should provide to them, should provide to Ukraine. And we have those kind of debates here. That this is a free country, and our leaders in this country respond to public opinion. Putin does not care what the Russian people think. Saddam Hussein, when he was over Iraq, did not care what the people in Iraq thought. Neither did Assad in Syria. So, but we have a country that's responsive to the electorate, to the citizens.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned China. So when I had Dr. Nam on, we talked a little bit about China, but I would be interested to hear your opinions, because I think what I took away from him is that he kind of said that they're not a threat yet. They're not at that stage yet where they're launching all these moves, but do you think that that's coming for China, that that's their plan?
Well, they typically have tried to push the envelope whenever there's a new president. It doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. They test the waters to see what the position's going to be. There's no doubt they want to dominate things politically and economically. They bear watching, of course. One of the things that I stumbled across, actually, in work on one of my, I'm working on a book on Senator Allen, and one of my chapters is on Allen's filibuster of returning the Panama Canal to Panama. He led that filibuster in 1977, 1978. And, of course, the Panama Canal was built so you could have a two-ocean navy, and it was completed in 1903, and there began a debate about whether you should return that to the people of Panama. And so China is in Latin America area and implementing what we call Belt and Road initiatives, where they're coming in and offering to do all these special projects for these countries that need some help, of course. And they'll loan them money for different things, and then when these countries cannot pay, then China's going to seize it. They have decided that Panama is a strategic hub for them. Now, if they decide to give grief over Panama, that won't stand. And one of the concerns in 1978 about returning the canal to Panama was, how would you defend it against the Soviet Union, or Chinese aggression? So not a lot of attention's being paid right now to anything in Latin America, because everything is being focused on in the Middle East and in Europe and so forth. As I said earlier, the whole world's on fire. But very quietly. But we could be doing that for these Latin American countries. We could come in and offer to, do various things. Well, in the country of Yemen that I visited, China had built a number of the roads in Yemen. I didn't know that till I went over there. So they very quietly do some of these things, and some of these quieter moves are probably the things that we need to be monitoring more.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective because I've never even heard that's what they do. So I'm glad that you mentioned that because I'm sure most people don't know that. So you sent me an article that you said that you wanted to talk about, and I think this is so interesting. And you said that you're trying to turn it into a book, which of course does not surprise me coming from you. But can you kind of explain what it is and what it's about?
Oh, I'll be glad to. It's actually an article that's in the spring edition of Alabama Heritage Magazine. That magazine is published 4 times a year, and it's a peer-reviewed magazine, but it's not like an academic journal where just PhDs might be reading it. So the general public, like I know a lot of non-academics that subscribe to Alabama Heritage because they have stories like the one I'm about to tell you about Senator Allen. They have stories about wildlife. They had a good one on Congressman John Lewis because the boy from Troy was the subtext of that article. So they publish things that are of interest to people in Alabama on a variety of different topics. And Senator Allen was in the U.S. Senate. He was elected in 1968. He will die in office from a heart attack in 1978. I jokingly say not much has been written about him because he wasn't a demagogue, a womanizer, or a drunk. So people didn't think he was interesting, but he was interesting. And he was from over in Gadsden. And he was a contemporary of George Wallace and Big Jim Folsom. And he would be aligned with Wallace on some things. He would distance himself from Wallace on others. He was opposed to Folsom in Folsom's first term as governor. Folsom wanted to implement a lot of different initiatives, and Allen was in the legislature at the time. But he will mend fences with both of these political icons in Alabama. Later in his life, they had interesting interactions, basically from the 1950s on, and of course those were interesting times in Alabama and the nation. Civil rights, the Cold War, the succession bill in the state of Alabama when Wallace wanted to change the Alabama Constitution so he could succeed himself. Alabama didn't trust elected officials, so she had a law in place where you served one term, then you had to go sit out a term and then come back and run again. So Allen had served in the legislature in Alabama. He took a hiatus from that so he could go serve in World War II. Interesting thing about Allen, he graduated high school at age 15.
Wow.
And he started law school, and the Great Depression hit, so the family could not afford for him to stay, and so he took a crash course, if you will, at Jones School of Law, and then took and passed the bar. This is after only 1 year of law school. Is very intelligent, very
That's
quick
very
on
impressive.
He was known for his Master of Parliamentary Procedures. In fact, he wrote a monologue on it when he got to the U.S. Senate. He made that his forte. That's what he was known for, and that's why he was so effective on the floor of the Senate. He presided over the Senate, which a lot of freshman senators, they're given that chore, and most of them hate it. He loved it, because that's how he learned the rules. So when he would be on the floor of the Senate, he would make a motion on something while the other senators were still trying to figure out what was going on. And he would never have to look at the Senate rule book. He would never have to consult with a Senate parliamentarian. So he was in favor of legislative supremacy and also fiscal restraint. And he had concerns about China even then. In fact, he was critical of Nixon's visit to China. So Allen was what we called a Southern Democrat. Some people are old enough to remember what that animal was. Now you no longer really have Southern Democrats. They're either dead or they're now Republicans. But they were a very interesting vote bloc at the time. And so Allen was well thought of by people on both sides of the political aisle. So he also did 2 terms of lieutenant governor. He would not gavel through the succession bill that Wallace assumed that he would. He allowed a filibuster on the floor of the Alabama Senate, and it failed, and that's why Wallace had to run his wife Lurleen. And so then Allen, we'll see there's an opening in 1968 because Lister Hill was not going to run again, because by then Hill's political views were really out of step with those of most of Alabama. And so Allen will not be instrumental in passing a lot of legislation, but his mantra was basically, it's more important to stop bad legislation than it is to pass good legislation. And there's a lot of truth in that. When I was an elected official at the county level, we paid attention to what the Alabama legislatures were doing to see if it was going to be harmful for the counties. If we thought it was going to be harmful for the counties, we made a move to try to stop it or to make changes to it. But Allen was known for his filibusters, and the original purpose of old-style filibusters was to force a compromise on a bill or on a piece of legislation. What can we do to this to make it acceptable to enough people? And he always believed that the opposition side had the right to speak. And so very skilled in terms of parliamentary procedures, very much a traditionalist. I interviewed Senator Bob Dole several years ago because he was a colleague of Allen's. And I asked Senator Dole, what do you think Jim Allen would think about Congress right now? And this is before it got to the degree it is now. And Senator Dole said, well, I don't think he would recognize the place. So he was very mindful of the institution of the Senate, the rules and the procedures, the history of the Senate, of that body. And as I mentioned earlier, legislative supremacy was paramount for him because that's the body that is the most responsive to the people. And he was known for visiting each county in the state once a year. He would have what we call Dutch treat dinners. In fact, I found some old photos at the state archives when he visited in Gadsden, which was his home county, of course. The dinner was, and Dutch treats mean you pay for your own meal, of course. And they had boxed dinners brought in from Kentucky Fried Chicken. You could see it clearly on the side. And so after everybody ate their KFC, then he would give a report from Washington, and he would take questions from people. And so he was the first modern senator. He established offices throughout the state, and he was the only U.S. senator that actually had an office in their state capital. He was very close friends with McDowell Lee, who was the Secretary of the Senate, and they gave him an office there down in Montgomery. So he had that office there. He was known for constituent service. He insisted that all the mail be open. Now, this is before computers. This is before all the luxuries that we now have. I know a lot of your listeners may not even know what a typewriter is. I had to take typing when I was in school. I had to learn on a typewriter. It's a lot harder than doing it on a computer. So he would insist that all the mail be answered that day, and he would sign all of his own letters. And if he was reviewing a letter and he found an error on it, instead of making just a little mark where you probably could have taken some white out and corrected, he'd make a big mark on the whole page. So the whole page would have to be retyped. So he was quite a stickler, for that. And he did a monthly newsletter to all his constituents. So if you were at that Dutch treat dinner and you weren't on that mailing list, you signed up. I found old mailing list in the archive boxes. So he was known for his filibusters. His last one would be to filibuster giving the Panama Canal back to Panama. And it only passed by one vote to give Panama back. And so one of his concerns was the defense of the canal. And now, you say, well, why is that relevant? Well, look, China knows it's important. Yeah. China wouldn't be trying to make it a strategic hub.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you're writing this because I'm sure most people don't know this information. And it's so cool that you've been able to go find all of these documents in the archives that are adding to your article that you're writing.
Well, when I went to the archives, they told me I was the first person that had asked to see what we call the Allen Papers. And I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I asked. I said, well, I want to see the Panama Canal stuff first. And they bring out like 6 boxes. I said, oh. And they said, this isn't all of them. And the letters were overwhelming in support of Allen's position. That the Senate broke a rule that they'd had in place for the whole time of the institution of the body. They passed a resolution allowing the Panama Canal debates to be broadcast on NPR radio, and they allowed radio and TV coverage. So you had newspaper, TV, radio, and so it really captivated the whole nation. He even got letters from people outside of Alabama. One lady sent him a Valentine she'd made, and one couple said, if Alabama ever gets tired of you, you can come to our state and be our U.S. Senator. And so, he really got a lot of, notoriety for that, in part because, and part of that was, he died of a heart attack shortly after. And some made the assertion that that filibuster fight, was part of it. He had, he'd had a heart attack years earlier, but most people didn't know about it. And he was a diabetic. So when he would lead a filibuster, and this is when you had real filibusters, where you could not leave the floor of the Senate to go to the restroom, to get anything to eat, to go to sleep. So he would be on the floor of the Senate with a tube of cherry-flavored glucose. So he'd be snacking on that so he could stay on the floor of the Senate because he was a diabetic. So he had to have his nourishment, and I'm embarrassed to tell you how many years I've actually been researching this. As they say, life happened, and so, but about 20 years or so, and whenever I write a chapter or an article or whatever, I always have my mother read it. And the reason I have my mother read it is my mother's a bright woman, but my mother did not go to college, and I want to write things that I don't want to write just for other PhDs. I want to write something that people that have an interest in history and politics would want to read and would enjoy reading. And so that's how I do my measurement. And Allen ran for governor in 1954. That's a fascinating race. That involved Jim Folsom was running again, 2 or 3 other big characters, big names. That race did not go his way, and so a lot of people thought he was done in politics. His goose was cooked. But he comes back and serves as lieutenant governor again, and then runs for the U.S. Senate. But he's known for his skill with parliamentary procedures and what we had when we had the old-style filibusters that would lead to really compromise on legislation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you said you were going to turn this into a book. How long do you think it will take you to publish?
Well, I don't know.
This?
I've got several chapters written. I'm at a stage in my career where I need to, as the saying goes, fish or cut bait. I want to get it finished up. Allen died in 1978. There are already a lot of the people that would have remembered him who have already passed away. In fact, a number of the people that I interviewed over the years about their working with Senator Allen and so forth, they've passed away since I interviewed. Well, Senator Robert Dole passed away a few years ago. He was part of what you call that greatest generation. He could have gotten out of World War II, but he memorized the eye chart. He was colorblind, and so he memorized the eye chart so he could pass it because he wanted to go serve. Of course, that generation, they weren't perfect. They had their flaws, but that was a different breed of people, a different time. So people like Jim Allen, and who was a Democrat, Robert Dole, who was a Republican. Allen had friends across the aisle. Ted Kennedy, as liberal as he was, actually he and Allen forged a friendship. Allen's problem with Ted Kennedy was that Kennedy had to have 3 or 4 staffers on the floor of the Senate feeding him information, if he seated behind him so he could make his points and so forth. Allen didn't have any staffers. Allen had it all up in his head and on his feet. He could do that, and so he introduced a piece of legislation to limit the number of staffers that you could bring on the floor of the Senate. And so there's a lot of interesting little stories, and so I'm weaving those stories in with the events of the state at the time and the events nationally, because that time period from 1940s to 1978 in Alabama's history and our nation's history covered a lot of big things, and so he was a thread in that, but he just hasn't been given the attention for whatever reason. So the deeper I dug into the research, the more I wanted to dig, and the more I wanted to write additional chapters on him and his service and his interaction. I was at a conference last week, and there was a man seated at my table. He was in communication. He was a broadcaster at a station in Mobile and Birmingham, and I presented one of my book chapters at a conference last week. And he said, I interviewed Senator Allen when I was first starting out in the news media at the beginning of my career, and then I interviewed him at the end of my career, too. And so you'll be surprised how many people you'll bump into that, there's some sort of connection there. We've had a lot of students from JSU I found over the years who said, I interned for Senator Allen. I loved interning for Senator Allen. So they've got a Senator Allen story. So anybody that has a Senator Allen story, I'm interested in hearing it, because those stories are things that people want to, people like those personal connections.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I am so excited. Whenever you publish this book, I'll be one of the first ones to sign up to read it. I'm sure it will be great. You're such a remarkable woman, and I'm so happy that you were able to come on my show today. So, we do have to wrap it up, but I always ask everybody the same question. So what is like the number one thing that you would want people to take away from this episode?
I would encourage people to, whether they're looking at domestic politics or international affairs, consult multiple news sources. Our media here, they do not do the best job covering the Middle East or European affairs, and certainly Latin American affairs. But BBC has an outlet. A number of the other newspapers, German and France, they have an English translation. It's nice to get a different perspective on world events than just what we have here, because what we have here is not necessarily as detailed. And just a point of irony, the American people do not focus as much on foreign affairs when they vote. And people outside the United States find that odd, that foreign policy is not as important to the American people. Now, it was in 2006 with the war in Iraq. That war came home, and the American people sent George W. Bush a message. But most of the time, it would be a domestic issue. And regardless of who wins in November, these problems are still going to be there, these problems and these challenges. So I would encourage people to not bury your head in the sand. I know it's tempting to do that sometimes, because a lot of things are very discouraging. But you will find there's when you peel back some of the layers, there's some good things going on in the world, and there's some good people out there who are trying to do the right thing. And so I would encourage people to use their brains and do consult multiple sources of information. And to do that before they speak or before they type something in social media.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and definitely one that I know that you hit on as a teacher too. So I think that's a really good point for everybody to take home. But thank you, Dr. Owens, so much for coming on, taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you've got to run off and go teach a class, but I really appreciate it.
Well, Chloe, I want to thank you for doing this, starting this program and interviewing various people on campus. This is quite a service to the JSU campus, and it's a feather in your cap that you're doing something like this. So thank you for all your work on this, because I know it's a lot of extra work.
It is, but I love doing it, so it's all right. But thank you for your encouragement. I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for listening, and until next time, this is Chloe Cooley signing off.